The White House is pushing back against House Democrats' impeachment inquiry, escalating the fight between the two branches of government.
On Tuesday night, the Trump administration sent House Speaker Nancy Pelosi and her committee chairs a letter refusing to comply with the House impeachment inquiry, calling it unconstitutional and a violation of due process. Some constitutional lawyers say the White House's vow to not cooperate is unprecedented, and it may not spare him from being formally charged.
Keir Dougall is joining us now for more on this. He's a CBSN legal contributor and former assistant U.S. attorney for New York's Eastern District. Thanks for joining us, Keir.
Good morning.
So in that White House letter, one of the things that the lawyers said was that this whole thing was unconstitutional, right? So from a constitutional perspective, does this make any sense?
No, this is really much more of a political argument, I think, than a valid legal argument. Mm-hmm. To put a fine point on it, you know, this is like an argument for squirrels because it's really nuts. Okay.
I like that. So, you know, the Constitution does sort of lay out, though, the responsibilities of Congress in terms of when it comes to impeachment, but it's very vague.
Right, so the Constitution says that the House has the sole power of impeachment. It also says the House can set its own rules. And so it's really important to remember when the framers brought in the high crimes and misdemeanors language and imported all that practice from England, they were very careful to carve out one of the things that the English used to do with their impeachments that we don't do now. So back in England, if you were impeached, you could be punished afterwards. You could be sentenced to death. You could be put in jail. Under our Constitution, the consequences of impeachment are simply removal from office and a potential barring, a debarment from holding a future office, substantially lowering the stakes of what's involved in an impeachment. So when you talk now about this process of due process, when the House is considering whether to bring articles of impeachment, the closest analogy that you can draw is unfortunately, is to the criminal process, even though what's at stake here is not punishment of the president. It's simply removal of an errant president, somebody who's unfit to protect our society and to protect the Constitution. But even in a criminal investigation, where a grand jury is considering bringing an indictment or charges similar to an impeachment that would contain charges, a defendant doesn't have the right to bring witnesses before the grand jury, at least in the federal system, does not have the right to participate in grand jury proceeding, doesn't have the rights that Mr. Cipollone is demanding on behalf of President Trump in connection with consideration of articles of impeachment. Now, those issues, whether the president could present witnesses at a Senate trial, whether the President's counsel should be able to cross-examine witnesses at a Senate trial, those are completely different questions. I think those arguments would have a much more solid footing for President Trump. But the notion right now that he should have this broad panoply of rights just doesn't really hold water.
Because the place that we are at right now is part of the investigative process.
Correct.
Right? So they're looking to see what's happening here.
Correct.
Yeah.
I mean, hundreds of defendants are indicted each week in the federal system, and they don't have the right to put their own evidence in front of the grand jury and cross-examine the prosecutor's witnesses, and it just doesn't happen. It's really foreign to that practice.
The House Speaker Nancy Pelosi recently, in a statement, said that the president is not above the law. The rights that you're talking about, the president seems to often indicate that the Constitution grants him powers that he does not have. But what are his rights as the chief executive based on what is written in the Constitution when it comes to an impeachment inquiry? Just lay them out for our audience so that
Sure.
when the president says, you know, I can thumb my nose at this impeachment inquiry, what are his rights as it relates to his title, his you know, the fact that he's the elected chief executive?
So the Constitution has this, it's basically a safety valve, right? So we didn't want to have a king, and we didn't want to have a president who would be elected for a term of life. We have we all know we have four-year elections, but the framers thought even that might not be enough. You might have a bad president, and you might not be able to wait for 4 years. So they created this escape valve of impeachment. The president really does not have many rights in connection with the Congress's actions. The Constitution says the House has the sole power of impeachment and can set its own rules. That he does not have a right to a bipartisan impeachment.
The House can set its own rules.
Correct.
That's really interesting.
Yes, and so can the Senate. He doesn't have the right to a bipartisan impeachment. He doesn't have a right to, he has whatever rights the House decides to give him, which basically means that he doesn't have any rights effectively in connection with the House's consideration of impeachment. In the Senate, that's described as a trial. Importing other notions of what a trial ought to look like, effectively, disputed facts, what the outcome ought to be. That's something where you would expect that the Senate would allow for witnesses to come in. They can decide that, allow for how the evidence would be presented, allow for who would be able to represent the president. So this is more of a political process, but the Constitution does not give the president a whole lot of rights here, other than that he cannot be removed unless the Senate, by a 2/3 majority, decides to remove him. That is probably his most important right under the Constitution.
So that letter also called for a full House vote on this impeachment inquiry. And then we just sort of heard the president kind of a little bit push back on that. He said that, yeah, he would, comply with the vote as long as there weren't any sort of crazy things that he didn't like sort of put in there. With this phrase that the House can set its own rules, this vote, if there was one, because it seems like that conversation is popping up more and more, would that vote also include setting its rules to move forward?
No, the House already has rules.
Okay.
But in connection with a specific impeachment inquiry, if there were additional questions would come up, the House could set its own rules. Right. So, yeah, and on the question of should the House take a vote to somehow authorize this impeachment inquiry, the House isn't required to.
But they have before.
They have before, but that doesn't mean that they have to now.
He's trying to force them to do so, but it's not very clear that even if the House actually went from beyond the inquiry to what the White House is asking for them to do, daring them to do essentially, that they would comply, because historically, just going by precedent, this White House has not complied with requests from Congress. And that's why some people have said that we're on the precipice of this constitutional crisis, because what if the courts get involved and the president decides to thumb his nose at the courts?
Right. So that's a number of people have noticed that the demand that the House take a vote to authorize its impeachment inquiry isn't accompanied by a promise from the president. Oh, well, if you do that,
then I will provide you the documents.
But does he have an argument when the president says, I'm not being treated fairly, and this is the type of vote that occurred before? Does he have a strong argument there?
Well, he has the argument. It's a political argument. I don't think it's a legal argument. Look, the flip side of this, the danger for the House, is that if it is too partisan, right, then it's going to make it very difficult for the House members to have him removed in the Senate, right? It does ultimately need to, I think, have a bipartisan basis. But are we in a constitutional crisis? I don't think we're there yet. We're obviously in a constitutional standoff, in a dispute. The president's actions to, across the board, refuse to comply with the House's impeachment and oversight functions is unprecedented. We say that a lot, but it is actually true here. I think we would be in a constitutional crisis, Vlad, as you mentioned, if the president were to defy or ignore a final order of the court. Then we would have a crisis. If the president were to refuse to leave office, if he were voted to be removed after impeachment, we would have a constitutional crisis. If he were to refuse to relinquish the office after an election that he lost, then we would have a constitutional crisis. Right now, I think we're in the middle of a dispute, and it may be resolved in the courts. It may be resolved by the House sending the sergeant at arms out to arrest people. It may be resolved in budget negotiations. There are a number of levers yet that the Congress can pull and that the president can still pull.
Speaking of unprecedented, food for thought, the president is impeached, as it likely appears he might be by the House. Whether he's removed or not, he can still run for president again. Wouldn't that be something? Because in the last couple of instances, Bill Clinton was in his second term. Andrew Johnson was not up for re-election. Could be interesting.
See, now the framers were very smart about this. The impeachment does not result just in removal. It can also result in being barred from ever holding office under the
So I guess
Constitution
that would have
ever
to be
again.
spelled out if it was a successful impeachment.
Those are the two consequences that are allowed, and it's to protect the Constitution and our country from a president who has been determined already to be unfit or a danger.
Really interesting. Keir,
that is.
always great to have you, man. That was really interesting. Thank you
you.
very much. Appreciate it.